You're standing on a hill. It is the middle of the afternoon, and the sky is black. Not cloudy, not overcast, black, the kind of dark that has no business being here at noon, and every single person around you knows it. They have gone quiet. Even the soldiers have gone quiet. 10 feet in front of you, a man is hanging from a wooden cross. His arms are stretched wide. Iron nails pin his wrists to the wood. His face is barely recognizable. Swollen, lacerated. A ring of thorns has been hammered into his scalp, and the blood has dried in streaks down his face, into his beard. He has been up there since 9 this morning. You watch his legs begin to shake, and then, slowly, with enormous, obvious effort, he pushes himself upward. His whole body lifts an inch, maybe 2, pressing his feet down onto the nail that holds them to the wood. His face contorts. He does it just to breathe, just to empty his lungs enough to fill them again. And then, in a voice louder than anything you've heard from him today, he looks up at the black sky and screams, in Aramaic, the dialect of his village, the language his mother sang to him, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The words go up into the darkness. Nothing comes back. This is Jerusalem. The year is 30 AD, and you have been standing here on this hill for 6 hours. But to understand this moment, to truly feel the weight of what you're watching, you need to go back 24 hours, back to where this night began. Because 24 hours ago, this man was sitting at a table with his closest friends, breaking bread. And what happened between that table and this cross is the most documented, most analyzed, most argued over sequence of events in all of human history. And most people still don't know what actually happened. Today, you will. It is Thursday evening, and Jerusalem is overwhelming. You have never seen a city like this. The historian Josephus will later estimate 3 million pilgrims packed into Jerusalem for Passover. Even if that number is exaggerated, you believe it the moment you try to move through these streets. The upper city is a wall of bodies and heat and noise and smell. Every alley is jammed. Every rooftop has a family on it. And the smell hits you before anything else. Lamb fat dripping into fire. Cumin, bitter herbs, the absence of leavened bread, because tonight every family in this city is eating unleavened. It is the eve of Passover, the holiest night of the Jewish year, and the entire city smells of the meal that commemorates the night God passed over Egypt. You press through the crowd and follow a group of men up a stone staircase on the side of a building. The steps are worn smooth, 1,000 feet before yours. At the top, a single large room. The simple, earthen floor, woven mats, whitewashed walls, oil lamps throwing warm, unsteady light, low tables, cushions arranged for reclining. 13 men file in. You watch the last one enter. He removes his outer robe without ceremony. He looks around the room slowly, carefully, and it is the way someone looks at a place they are memorizing. Not surveying, memorizing. The way you look at something you know you are seeing for the last time. Then he picks up a basin. He fills it with water. He picks up a towel. And he kneels down in front of Simon Peter. In this world, in this culture, washing feet is the task of the lowest slave in the household. So low, in fact, that a Jewish slave cannot be required to do it. Only Gentile slaves wash feet. And the man kneeling on this floor is the one they call Rabbi. The one they left their fishing boats for. The one they watched transfigure on a mountaintop into something that terrified them. And he is on his knees in the dirt with a basin of water and a towel. Peter pulls back. He physically recoils the way you'd snatch your hand from an open flame. "You will never wash my feet." Not false modesty, genuine horror. Jesus looks up at him. Whatever is in his eyes stops Peter cold. "If I don't wash you, you have no part with me." Peter's voice changes. Immediately. "Then not just my feet, My hands and my head too. Jesus works his way around the room. Basin, towel, kneel, each man in turn. And then he reaches Judas. You know something the other 11 men in this room do not know. Judas has already been to the chief priests. He has already been paid. The arrangement is already made. Jesus knows this too. The text is explicit. He knows. And you watch his hands cup Judas's feet, lower them into the water, and wash them. The same hands, the same water, the same care. The lamp flickers. Shadows move across the white walls. There is bread on the low table. There is wine in a clay cup. There is a man washing the feet of his own executioner. And not one person in this room, except him, understands what this night is. The meal begins. Jesus takes the unleavened bread and breaks it. You hear that sound across the room. The clean, dry crack that only bread without yeast makes. He holds it up and says, with no special ceremony, no elevated tone, "This is my body." Nobody reacts the way they will, centuries from now, understand they should have. He pours wine. Dark wine, almost black in the lamplight. Passes the cup. Every man drinks. Judas drinks. And then he says it quietly, almost as an aside, the way you'd mention the weather. "One of you is going to betray me." The room freezes. You watch fear move through 12 men at once. It travels from face to face like a flame moving between candles. One by one they ask, some of them grabbing his arm, "Is it me, Lord? Is it me?" Jesus takes a piece of bread, dips it in the dish of bitter herbs, and hands it directly to Judas. Then he leans close. Low, so only Judas can hear, "What you are about to do, do it quickly." The others don't understand. They think Judas is being sent on an errand. Something ordinary. Judas stands, takes the bread, does not look at anyone. He walks to the door, opens it, and for just a moment, before the door swings shut behind him, you see the alley outside, black, cold, the glow of the city somewhere in the distance. The door closes, and John, the youngest man in the room, will later write this moment down in 5 words. 5 words, the most cinematic sentence in any sacred text ever written. And it was night. 5 full seconds of silence. The door is closed. Judas is gone, and everyone who remains feels it. A change in the air, the way a room feels when a storm has begun outside and you cannot see the lightning yet, but you can feel the pressure dropping. Jesus begins to speak, and the way he speaks now is different from anything you've heard from him before. Not teaching, not parable. This is a man saying goodbye to people he loves. And he knows it, and they don't. "Do not let your hearts be troubled. In my Father's house are many rooms. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." Peter promises to follow him anywhere, to die for him if it comes to that. Jesus looks at him. Something tired and gentle and already knowing moves across his face. "Before the rooster crows tonight, you will say 3 times that you don't know me." Peter shakes his head. Hard. Never. Jesus doesn't argue. He holds Peter's gaze for a moment longer than is comfortable. He knows what tonight holds for every man in this room. He knows who will run. He knows who will deny. He knows who will scatter into the dark. And he has washed all of their feet anyway. In a few minutes, you're going to follow him into a garden on the other side of the valley. And what happens to him there, what his body does under the weight of what is coming, is something most people who know this story have never fully understood. You step outside. The cold hits you immediately, not brutal but real. April nights in Judea lose heat fast once the sun drops. You feel it in your face and your hands as you follow the group into the street. And then they do something unexpected. They sing. Matthew and Mark both record this. Before going to the garden, Jesus and his disciples sang a hymn. The Hallel, Psalms 115 through 118, the traditional close of every Passover Seder. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his love endures forever. 11 voices moving through the narrow streets of Jerusalem under a full Passover moon. From houses on either side of the alley, other Passover groups are singing the same psalms. The whole city is one vast, open-air cathedral, and the sound is extraordinary. They descend the steep eastern slope of Jerusalem, cross the Kidron Valley, a narrow stream bed, barely a trickle this time of year. You step over it easily, but the smell stops you. Something heavy and metallic hangs in the air over the valley. Takes you a moment to identify it. Blood. The blood of tens of thousands of lambs sacrificed at the temple today. The Passover sacrifice drains through underground channels and seeps into the Kidron. You are breathing it in without meaning to. The smell of Passover from underneath. They climb the lower slope of the Mount of Olives. Jesus hasn't stopped talking since they left the upper room. His words come in long, unhurried streams. The most personal thing you've ever heard from him. I am going to prepare a place for you. You watch the men around him as he speaks. None of them look like they understand that these are the last words he will say to them as a free man. He is saying goodbye, and they think he is teaching. The garden appears as a darker darkness between the trees. Gethsemane, in Aramaic, oil press. It is an olive grove, ancient even by the standards of this ancient city. The trunks of the trees are massive, twisted into shapes that belong more to geology than to botany. The roots surface from the ground like old veins. Some of these trees are over 2,000 years old. Standing here, you are close enough to touch the same bark that was here that night. Jesus pauses at the entrance and turns to 8 of the disciples. Sit here while I go and pray. They settle into the roots and the shadows. You follow with the 3, Peter, James, and John, as Jesus leads them deeper into the grove. And then he stops. Something happens in him so abruptly that you feel it before you see it. Not a sound, not a gesture, a change. The way a temperature drops when a cloud moves over the sun, except darker. A sudden, unmistakable weight descending. Mark uses 2 Greek words here that are almost impossible to translate. The first means to be seized by a terror that paralyzes, a visceral, physical dread that roots you to the spot. The second describes a distress so deep, so total, that it crosses into something bodily, something closer to nausea than to ordinary grief. Matthew uses a third word, surrounded on all sides by sorrow, encircled by it. No way out. Jesus presses his hand against the bark of an olive tree for a moment. Then he turns to the 3. His voice, when he speaks, is raw in a way you have not heard before. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here. Keep watch with me. He walks further into the grove, maybe 30 meters. You can still see him in the moonlight, barely. And then he falls. Not kneels. Falls. Mark's verb describes a body giving out, legs that simply stop working. He goes down onto his knees and then forward, face pressing into the dark soil of the olive grove, arms stretched out in front of him. And from the ground, face down in the dark, alone, he prays, Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Abba. You know enough to feel the weight of that word. It is what a Jewish child calls their father, not the formal address, not the theological title. The intimate one, the domestic one, the one that means, Daddy. It is the only time in any of the 4 Gospels that Jesus addresses God this way in direct prayer. And he uses it now, face down in the dirt, in the dark, in an olive grove, asking, not to die. You stay very still, and then you notice something in the moonlight, something on his face, on his forehead, something darker than sweat, falling into the soil. Luke, the only physician among the four gospel writers, records it with clinical precision. And what he records has a medical name: hematidrosis. It is a real condition, documented, extraordinarily rare. Most physicians will never see a case in their entire career. It occurs under conditions of acute psychological terror. The capillaries that supply blood to the sweat glands rupture under the pressure of surging adrenaline. Blood seeps into the sweat ducts and emerges from the skin, mixed with sweat. It is painful. It leaves the skin so sensitive that even the touch of fabric becomes difficult to tolerate. And it means that before a single soldier has laid a hand on him, before a single nail has been driven, before a single blow has landed, Jesus' body is already beginning to break down, under the weight of what he knows is coming. He prays. Then he gets up, walks back to Peter, James, and John. They are asleep. You watch him stand over them in the moonlight, and the expression on his face. You look for anger, you expect anger, and what you find instead is something worse, something quieter and more absolute. The face of a man who is, in this moment, completely, entirely alone. Simon, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Not anger, not accusation, loneliness. He goes back, prays again, returns, asleep, prays a third time, returns, still asleep, 3 times, the same 30-meter walk, the same dirt under his hands, the same prayer, the same 3 sleeping men. You watch each return drain something from him that does not come back. The third time, he does not try to wake them. He stands over them for a moment, then says quietly, "Enough, the hour has come." And then his head comes up. Across the valley, moving through the golden gate of the city, a procession of torches. Dozens, no, hundreds. A river of fire winding down the hillside, crossing the stream bed, beginning to climb toward the garden. You hear them before you can make out faces. Armor, sandals on stone, voices in Latin, voices in Aramaic. And at the front of the procession, walking faster than the soldiers behind him, is a face you know. The torchlight floods the garden. You count the soldiers and lose count. A Roman cohort, potentially hundreds of men, plus temple guards from the chief priests. They carry swords, clubs, lanterns. The firelight moves between the olive trunks like something alive, throwing lurching shadows that stretch and collapse and stretch again. Judas is walking point. He moves directly toward Jesus with the confidence of someone who has rehearsed this in his head a dozen times. The plan is simple. He had arranged a signal. "The one I kiss, that's him. Arrest him." A kiss was the standard greeting between a disciple and his rabbi. Completely ordinary. Nothing suspicious. Judas reaches Jesus, looks at him, "Rabbi," and kisses him. But the Greek verb Mark uses is not the ordinary word for a kiss. It is the intensified form, prolonged, demonstrative kiss. The kind that communicates deep, warm, unmistakable affection. Not a quick touch. The real thing, performed. Jesus looks at Judas. One beat, just one. "Friend, do what you came for." The soldiers move in. Peter grabs the knife he's been carrying under his robe and swings. Catches Malchus, the high priest's personal servant, takes his right ear clean off. Blood, shouting, bodies lurching in all directions in the torchlight. Jesus steps forward, touches the ear. Luke, the physician, records that the ear was healed. Then Jesus turns to Peter. "All who draw the sword will die by the sword." The soldiers close in, and the disciples run. Every single one of them, the men who 3 hours ago swore they would follow him to death. Gone. Scattering into the dark between the olive trees, running down the hillside, into the ravine, into the city. Anywhere that is not here. Mark adds one detail so strange and specific it could only have come from someone who was there. A young man following along, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his bare body, was grabbed by a soldier, twisted free, left the linen behind, and ran naked into the darkness. Most scholars believe this is Mark himself, signing his gospel with his own humiliation. He was there, he ran, and he spent the rest of his life writing down what he saw. The garden is quiet now. Jesus stands in the center of it. His hands are being tied behind his back. He does not resist. He looks once, just once, at the gap in the trees where his friends disappeared. Then the soldiers march him back toward the city. The trials happen fast. Too fast. Annas first, the former high priest, the old patriarch who still runs everything from the back of the room. Just a look at the prisoner. A political visit. Then Caiaphas, his son-in-law. And the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council of Jewish law, 71 members, assembled in the middle of the night. In the middle of the night, during Passover. Both of those things are direct violations of Jewish law. Jewish law explicitly prohibits capital trials at night. Jewish law explicitly prohibits capital trials during religious festivals. The men who are about to try Jesus for his life are breaking the very law they have sworn to uphold. And they are doing it in a hurry, because they know that if daylight comes before they have their verdict, the crowd in Jerusalem for Passover will make execution impossible. The goal is not justice. The goal is a verdict before dawn. You make your way into the courtyard of Caiaphas's house. It is cold. The limestone radiates cold through the night, and by 1 in the morning the courtyard feels like a cellar. Near the center, someone has built a charcoal fire, orange and snapping, throwing heat in a short radius. Guards and servants cluster around it. And there, at the very edge of the firelight, hunched into his cloak with his hood pulled forward, is Peter. He followed. Of all the disciples, he alone came this far. You watch him work at looking ordinary, like a man who belongs here, like a man with nothing to hide. A servant girl moves through the crowd. She slows near Peter, looks at him, looks again. You were with him, the man from Galilee. Peter doesn't miss a beat. I don't know what you're talking about. His voice is steady. He has thought about this. He is ready. She moves on. A few minutes pass. The fire crackles. You watch Peter's hands, wrapped around each other in his lap. They are not still. Someone else stops. You're one of them, aren't you? I am not. More time. The fire. The cold. Sounds from inside the house, voices raised, then lowered. A third person, more confident now, louder. You absolutely have to be one of his disciples. Listen to your accent. You're Galilean. It's obvious. And Peter breaks. He doesn't just deny it. He calls down curses on himself. In Greek, the word is anathematizing. He invokes divine punishment if he is lying. He makes a spectacle of his innocence, loud enough for the whole courtyard to hear. I don't know the man. And into the silence that follows that, into that exact, precise silence, a rooster crows. Somewhere above the courtyard, on the exterior gallery that runs along the second floor of the house, a line of soldiers is moving Jesus from one room to another. And as they pass the open section of the gallery that looks down into the courtyard, Jesus turns his head, and he looks at Peter, across the distance, across the firelight, across everything. One look, no words, no pointing, no expression you can name with a single emotion. Just his eyes, finding Peter's, holding them. Peter stands up from the fire. He pushes through the gate. He is in the street. And then you hear it, even through the wall, even through the noise of the city, the sound of a man weeping in a way that has no bottom to it. Luke's Greek is bitter weeping. The word for bitter comes from a root meaning cutting, piercing, like a blade. It is the cry that comes from a man who has just watched himself become exactly who he swore he would never be. Inside the house, the guards have blindfolded Jesus. They hit him in the face. Prophesy, who just hit you? Come on. Prophesy. He doesn't answer. He doesn't make a sound. Dawn in Jerusalem comes like a verdict being read. One moment the city is wrapped in deep pre-dawn shadow, and then light detonates over the Mount of Olives. Blazing, sudden, without transition, and the white limestone walls of the city go from gray to blinding gold in the span of a single breath. Vendors, birds, the ordinary world returning, indifferent to everything that has happened in the dark. But the dark happened. The religious authorities have their verdict. What they do not have is the power to carry it out. Under Roman occupation, the Jewish council cannot execute anyone. For execution, they need Rome. They need the governor. They need Pontius Pilate. The visual in the Praetorium is one of the most absolute contrasts you have ever stood inside of. On the elevated judgment seat, elevated literally higher than everything else in the room, because the architecture of Roman power is designed to remind you where you stand, Pontius Pilate, governor of Judea, a man who can end any life in this province with a single word. In front of him, the man you have been following since the upper room. No sleep, no food since the bread and wine last night. Face swollen from hours of fists in the chief priest's house. Wrists bound, robes stained with dried blood, and yet standing, not slumped, not broken, standing, with a stillness that is different from resignation, different from defiance, and different from anything Pilate has ever seen in that chair. Are you the king of the Jews? Jesus looks at him. You have said so. Pilate waits. There has to be more. There is always more. This man has said 4 words and gone silent. Pilate pushes, presses. The chief priests are making accusations from the side of the room, the kind of thing that usually produces a torrent of self-defense from the accused. Jesus says nothing. Mark records Pilate's reaction with 1 word. He marveled. Not admired. Marveled. The astonishment of a man watching something he has never encountered in 20 years of governing a difficult province. He is choosing this silence. You've been with him all night. You know he can speak. He spoke for hours in that upper room in that garden. This silence is a decision, and the decision costs him everything. Pilate tries 3 times to release him. He sends him to Herod Antipas, who wanted to see a miracle, got silence, mocked him with a royal robe and sent him back. He offers the crowd a choice. Jesus or Barabbas, a man in prison for insurrection and murder. The crowd chooses Barabbas. Pilate calls for a basin of water. He washes his hands in front of everyone. I am innocent of this man's blood. The crowd answers, His blood be on us and on our children. Pilate gives the order. You need to understand what happens next, because what happens in the next 20 minutes determines whether Jesus is physically capable of surviving long enough to reach the cross. The instrument is called a flagrum. It is not a whip. A flagrum is a weapon designed for the specific purpose of destroying skin and the tissue beneath it. A short wooden handle from which hang 3 or more strips of leather, and embedded in the tip of each strip, lead weights cast in the shape of small dumbbells or fragments of sharpened bone. When the strip strikes skin, the weights drive in. When the soldier pulls back, they tear, pulling away skin, blood vessels, nerves, and muscle tissue. The resulting wounds are comparable to 3rd and 4th degree burns across the entire back, shoulders, and sides. Jewish law set a ceiling of 39 lashes. Roman law had no ceiling. The estimated blood loss from a severe Roman flogging, 1 to 2 liters, out of 5 to 6 in the human body. That threshold is enough to cause hypovolemic shock. What that means clinically: falling blood pressure, uncontrollable shaking, cold sweat, mental confusion, and an overwhelming, desperate thirst as the body signals it is running out of fluid to pump. After the flogging, the soldiers dress him. A purple robe, draped over his destroyed back, where even the touch of fabric is its own event. A crown woven from a local thorn bush with thorns 3 to 5 centimeters long, pressed into his scalp. a reed placed in his hand like a scepter. They kneel before him in mockery, then take the reed and beat it against the crown, driving the thorns deeper with each blow. The scalp is one of the most vascular regions of the human body. Blood runs down his face and into his eyes. When they bring him back out, Pilate presents him to the crowd with 2 words. In Latin, ecce homo. Here is the man. He thinks the sight of this broken man will move them, will trigger something human in the crowd. It doesn't. The shouting gets louder. Crucify him. You are in the street when they bring him out with the crossbeam. The patibulum, the horizontal beam, lies across his shoulders. 60 to 100 pounds of rough timber, balanced on a back that has been reduced to open wounds. The route to Golgotha is approximately half a mile, through narrow streets, over uneven cobblestones, uphill consistently toward the city gate. You walk with the procession. You watch him fall. He goes down hard, the beam hitting the ground with him. Soldiers haul him up. A few more steps. He falls again. His legs won't hold, not from weakness of will, but from physiology. A body that has lost up to 2 liters of blood, that is in hypovolemic shock, that has had no sleep and no food since the night before, that body does not have reliable legs. The soldiers reach into the crowd and grab a man. His name is Simon. He is from Cyrene, in North Africa. He has come to Jerusalem for Passover. He is given no choice. He picks up the beam. Mark, writing his gospel, records the names of Simon's sons, Alexander and Rufus. He names them because they are known, because Simon came home from that morning and told his children what he had done. And his children spent the rest of their lives telling people about their father. Women are weeping along the road. The women of Jerusalem who have watched this road before. Jesus hears them, and he stops. He can barely hold his head up. He can barely see through the blood from the crown of thorns. And he turns to these women and says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." It is a prophecy. In the year 70 AD, 40 years from this morning, Roman legions will put Jerusalem under siege. The famine inside the walls will reach a severity that the historian Josephus, who survived it, could barely bring himself to document. He records scenes of a city consuming itself from within. Jesus knows. In this moment, feet barely holding, vision obscured by blood, he is carrying a grief that extends 4 decades past this afternoon. You follow them through the gate in the city wall, out of the city, toward the hill. Golgotha, in Aramaic skull. You see why immediately. A low limestone outcropping just outside the city wall, rounded by centuries of wind and rain into a shape that, from a certain angle, with 2 shallow depressions worn into the stone face, looks exactly like a human skull. Not a dramatic hill, not the towering promontory that 2,000 years of paintings have made it. Just a worn, pale knob of rock beside the road, where everyone entering and leaving Jerusalem can see what happens here. The upright posts are already set permanently into the rock. Grooves are worn into the top of each post where the crossbeam slots in. This is not a special occasion. This is infrastructure. They lay him on the ground, on his back, arms extended across the beam. A soldier takes an iron nail, roughly 5 inches long, nearly an inch in diameter, and positions it at the wrist, specifically in the narrow space between the carpal bones, where the median nerve runs. The soldier raises the mallet. You turn away, but you hear it 3 times, 1 for each nail. Now here is what almost nobody tells you, and once you understand it, every single word he speaks from that cross will cost him more than you can imagine. Crucifixion does not kill by blood loss, kills by asphyxiation. The weight of a human body hanging by the arms fully extended, suspended from the wrists, locks the chest muscles in the position of maximum inhalation. The lungs fill, and they cannot empty. To exhale, to simply release the air, the crucified person must push upward, must press the nail-pierced feet down against the wood, lift the full weight of the body in order to relax the chest muscles enough to breathe out. Every breath out is a decision, made in full-body agony, and every word spoken from a cross requires first pushing up to exhale the old breath, then falling to inhale, then pushing up again to form words. Every word is a choice made in the most deliberate pain the human body can experience. Death comes when the person can no longer push, when they are too exhausted to make that choice one more time, when the last breath stays in. This process can take 3 hours, or 4 days. It is 9 in the morning. The nails are in. Above his head, a sign in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. 2 other men are crucified on either side of him. At the base of the crosses, the soldiers divide his clothing. They play dice for his robe because it is seamless, too good to cut. The crowd watches. You stay. The sun climbs. The April heat presses down with no shade on the hill. The wound sites from the flogging are found by insects almost immediately. The dehydration advances. The tongue swells. The lips crack. In 6 hours, he speaks 7 times. 7 sentences, each one purchased with a decision to push upward on the nails. You count them. The first, spoken almost immediately, while the soldiers are still gambling at the base of the cross. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they are doing. The soldiers do not look up from the dice. The second, to the man crucified on his right. This man has been cursing Jesus since he was nailed up, following the lead of the crowd. But at some point, something changes in him. He stops. He turns his head, and that act alone, that turning, is its own act of pain. He looks at Jesus and says quietly, meaning it, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus turns to look at him. "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." The third, looking down. Mary is standing at the base of the cross. She has been here since 9 in the morning. She has not moved. She will not move. Beside her is John, the youngest of the disciples, the one who did not run, the one who followed all the way to this hill. Jesus looks at his mother, then at John. His lungs are already beginning to fill with fluid. Every word costs a push, and he is making arrangements. "Woman, here is your son. Son, here is your mother, who will take care of her. After, when this is done, John will keep that promise for the rest of his life." At exactly noon, the middle of the day, the brightest hour, the sky goes dark. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record it. And they are not the only ones. Pagan historians, Roman writers who had no faith in Jesus, no stake in his story, no reason to invent this, mentioned an unusual darkness in their own chronicles from this period. They tried to explain it as a solar eclipse. But it cannot be a solar eclipse. Passover falls on a full moon. A solar eclipse requires a new moon. The physics do not work. The darkness has no natural explanation that fully satisfies the evidence. And for 3 hours, from noon to 3 in the afternoon, Golgotha is dark at midday. The crowd goes quiet. The soldiers stop gambling. The mockery stops. For 3 hours, you are standing in an unexplained darkness at noon in the middle of April. And the only sound is breathing, and the sound of a man on a cross deciding, every few minutes, to keep breathing. And then, into that darkness, the fourth word comes, louder than you expect. Mark calls it a cry, something that carries across the hill. And what he cries is not the formal Hebrew of the temple, not the Greek of commerce, not the Latin of occupation. It is Galilean Aramaic, the dialect of his village, the language of his childhood, the language his mother used, the language of every ordinary, unremarkable day of his life before this one.
Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani.
My God, My God, why have you forsaken me? The words go up into the darkness. They don't come back. Some people nearby mishear him. They think he is calling for the prophet Elijah. Someone runs to the soldier's supply, cheap sour wine mixed with water, soaks a sponge and lifts it to him. The fifth word, I am thirsty. 2 words. The most physical, the most human sentence he speaks from the cross. He drinks from the sponge. The 6th, 1 word in Greek, tetelestai. It is finished. In the commercial world of the ancient Near East, this word was stamped on receipts when a debt had been paid in full. Completely, nothing outstanding, nothing remaining. The account closed. The 7th and final word, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Mark writes, with a loud cry he breathed his last. The last decision, the last push upward on the nails, the last air leaving his lungs. And then the body stops pushing. The full weight falls onto the nailed arms, and his head drops forward. You look at your hands. It is 3 in the afternoon. At that moment in the temple, half a mile away, through the city walls, the great curtain tears. 60 feet of woven linen, thick as a man's hand, that has separated the Holy of Holies from everything else for generations. Tears from top to bottom, not bottom to top to bottom, as if pulled from above. The earth shakes, rocks split open. The Roman centurion who commanded this execution, a career soldier, a man who has watched many men die on this road, looks at the body on the cross and says, surely, this man was the Son of God. There is urgency now, and the urgency is bureaucratic. The sun is less than an hour from the horizon. When the first star appears, the Sabbath begins. And under Jewish law, no body may remain on a cross during the Sabbath, especially during Passover. The soldiers confirm the status of each condemned man. The 2 criminals on either side of Jesus are still alive. A soldier takes a heavy iron mallet and breaks their legs. 1 blow each. With their legs broken, they cannot push up. Without pushing up, they cannot exhale. Within minutes, they will suffocate. When the soldier reaches Jesus, he stops. He can see from the way the body hangs. But confirmation is required. He takes his spear and drives it upward into the right side of the chest, between the 5th and 6th rib. John, who is standing there, who sees this, records, immediately blood and water came out. The water is pericardial and pleural fluid, accumulated in the chest cavity over hours of trauma. Its presence is the clinical confirmation that this man has been dead long enough for fluid to pool. He is dead. A man named Joseph comes forward. He is a member of the Sanhedrin, the council that condemned Jesus this morning. But he voted against the condemnation. He goes to Pilate. He asks for the body. Pilate is surprised. Most crucifixion victims last far longer. He confirms with the centurion. He gives the order. Joseph brings fine linen, a long sheet, clean, the kind used for burial. And with him comes Nicodemus, another council member, a man who once came to Jesus in the middle of the night because he couldn't stop thinking about him. Nicodemus has brought spices, myrrh and aloes, mixed together, 75 pounds of them. That is a staggering amount. That is the amount used to bury a king. They take the body down from the cross. They remove the nails, carefully, methodically, as if it still matters how it's done. They wash the face, the hands, the feet. They wrap him in the linen with the spices folded in through every layer. Then they carry him to a new tomb, freshly cut from the limestone rock face nearby, never used before, and lay him inside. The stone is circular, riding in a carved groove in the rock. Several of them push. It grinds across the stone. It settles with a sound that echoes once from the walls of the tomb, and stops. You stand outside the sealed stone. The city sounds return around you. voices, cart somewhere, a child. The ordinary world, continuing the way it always continues. Behind the stone, nothing. No sound, no movement, no light, silence. You think about the last 24 hours, the upper room and the sound of unleavened bread breaking, the oil lamps on the white walls, the basin of water and the hands that moved from foot to foot, from the feet of fishermen to the feet of a tax collector, to the feet of the man who had the money already spent before he sat down to eat. The full Passover moon over the Kidron Valley, the smell of blood in the air, 11 voices singing a psalm none of them understood they were singing for the last time, the dark soil of Gethsemane, and a man's face pressing into it, the drops that were not sweat, the 3 loops of 30 meters, pray, return, sleeping, pray, return, sleeping, and the face of a man coming back to find that even being awake with him, was too much to ask. The river of torches, the kiss that lasted too long, the sound of sandals on stone, running, disappearing into the dark, the fire in the courtyard, and a fisherman's face in the instant the rooster crowed, the marble hall, the silence that was chosen, the sound you turned away from, 3 times, 7 sentences, each one a decision to keep breathing for one more moment. And then the stone, the groove in the rock, the sound it made when it settled, all of it led here, to a sealed tomb in the limestone bedrock of Jerusalem, and on the other side of that stone, in complete and total darkness, the body of a 33-year-old carpenter from Galilee, wrapped in linen, myrrh in every fold, alone. The Sabbath candles are being lit across the city. Families are sitting down to eat. The psalms are being sung. And somewhere, behind a door locked from the inside, 11 men are sitting in the dark, not eating, not speaking, flinching at every footstep in the street outside, trying to understand what has happened to them. They cannot. The longest night is over, and the longest wait of all has just begun. You came into this video standing on a hill outside Jerusalem. The sky was black at noon. A man was hanging from a cross 10 feet in front of you, and he pushed himself upward on iron nails and screamed at the darkness, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Now you know everything that came before that scream. You were in the room when he broke the bread. You were in the garden when his face was in the dirt. You were in the courtyard when the rooster crowed and Peter walked into the street. You were in the marble hall when he chose silence. You heard the mallet. You counted 7 words and you knew what each one cost. You stood outside the stone. You've walked every hour of the longest night. And the question that remains, the only question that actually matters, is not historical. It is not theological. It doesn't require a seminary degree or a church membership or a particular tradition. It is the question that every single person who has ever stood outside that sealed stone has had to answer for themselves, alone, in whatever quiet they could find. What do you do with this? If this video moved you, if you found yourself somewhere in that room, in that garden, on that hill, share it with someone who needs to hear it. You probably know exactly who that person is. And if you want to keep walking through history with us, through the moments that were almost lost, through the places that time tried to erase, through the stories that changed everything, subscribe to Sons of Dust. The next story is almost ready, and I see you in the dark.